I'm going to present an overview of the photographic methods that are being experimented with and actually used in aerial surveys, and briefly discuss some of the lessons learned and the ways forward. Though we're all familiar with these methods, I would just like to talk a little bit more about the way in which a human eye RSO count happens, because we need to talk about some of the contrast between the RSO and the oblique camera counts and why they're so different. We've been using the human eye in aerial surveys in sample counts for about 60 years or more. These were largely formalized by Mike Griffiths in his book Counting Animals in 1975, where he described the aerial sample counts, the systematic reconnaissance flights or SRF, total counts, and the aerial point sampling strategies that were used. And those methods have been used since, and everybody refers to Mike's book. Though Mike points out that these methods were never conceived of as being part of a multi-decade monitoring program, but instead they were really thought of as being part of 3 to 4 year individual studies, where individual RSOs would most likely be the same, and having consistency over 10, 20, or even 15 years was never designed for or considered, never something that was actually thought of for actually trying to keep the same person or the same monitoring system in place over the period of time. So these days we spend a lot of time trying to standardize for human counters, but the standardization takes a huge amount of the time when we're setting up for an SRF or any of these counts, and in spite of it, humans tend to be very inconsistent indeed. This diagram is a not too terribly to scale picture of how an SRF is conducted, with the sample strips on the left and right of the aircraft flight path and a few animals scattered around, but I just want to use this to illustrate some of the limitations that we're up against. We have humans on board, so we're having to optimize for the chance for humans to actually see things within those sample strips, which means that we have to fly low enough that humans can actually see things. We can fly high enough that we actually have the ground doesn't appear to be moving too quickly below us, which means about 350 feet above the ground. We're flying slow so that humans have a good chance to see things, and the standard is to have less than 1 square kilometer per minute of area searched. Transects themselves should be no longer than 20 minutes because the human brain simply can't concentrate for longer than 20 minutes. We tend to, at the 20-minute mark, we begin to think about other things, like how much our butts hurt or the tea break that's coming up. It becomes incredibly difficult to actually stay on target, as it were. Sessions themselves can last for no longer than 3 hours. So transects are usually broken at the very end. You have a brief chance to actually stop the focused activity that you're working on, and that 2 minutes to 5 minutes you have between transects is enough to kind of reset that fatigue, that transect fatigue. And you can do that for up to 3 hours, but after 3 hours, the fatigue that sets in, which we call type 2 fatigue, is typically overwhelming you already as well. We photograph groups, large groups. These are photographs which are triggered by the RSO from within the cabin. I'll show a photograph of that in a moment. And large groups means anything larger than 4 individuals for the human brain to function effectively. We do not count numbers naturally bigger than 4. We have to avoid the heat of the day because animals tend to hide under cover when we're in high sun angle, but very, very low sun angle in the early morning causes problems as well with very, very long shadows. We need to keep the aircraft as stable as possible. So, for example, in these transects that were being flown to Ruaha, the blue pilots transects had 1/4 the number of animals that were seen on the green transects. And of course, we reflew those transects. The stability is another really important factor. Observers have to sit in the same place for the entire transect, the entire session, and also have to retain their positions exactly for the weeks of the survey, or the days of the survey. Cameras help with the issues of counting bias. They do not help with detection in this case. This is simply there to actually help with the issues of group estimation, and often in the case of mixed groups, mixed herds, actually determine the exact numbers of each species within that group. Detection is a really difficult issue. You have about 3 seconds to cover an area that, about 200 meters across and 150 meters wide from the top to the bottom of the strip we're seeing here, and it can be incredibly easy to miss animals. When they're moving, it's easier, but especially where there's a higher amount of cover or any kind of dense vegetation, it becomes incredibly difficult, and you can actually feel. Is another example of the difficulty of detection, especially with long shadows. Though buffalo are incredibly large and relatively easy to see as being dark. We have been using cameras in the place of the human eye for decades, the wildebeest counts, the aerial point sampling. But this is a special case. This is a photograph of the vertical imagery, the nadir imagery that we use for the wildebeest counts. The scale of migration means that human counting and recording is completely overwhelmed, so we know we can't use the standard sample counts. Data become very biased. The APS can actually be carried out when the wildebeest are out in the short grass plains, which is relatively open, so photographs work. In this area, distinguishing wildebeest from termite mounds, zebra, and gazelles is relatively easy. And this kind of nadir count in very open habitats has taken place in the Arabian Shield, Mike Griffiths did decades ago, as well as in the Gobi Desert, and a few other, and to this day still being used for the wildebeest survey in Tanzania. So Richard Lamprey went to conduct surveys in Uganda in 2015 and was given a restriction that because of the funder was not allowing anybody to fly lower than about 500 feet above ground level, which was too high for the human eye to work. These restrictions meant that oblique camera counts had to be tried out, and Richard actually experimented and has managed to implement it successfully. So oblique camera counts replicate the RSO strip transect, but they take pictures continuously along the strip. The cameras can be figured internally in the case of Richard's aircraft, or semi-internally in the case of a window, which is partly open here. Richard actually has a great hole cut in the bottom of his aircraft to take pictures looking out. The camera angles are positioned around 45 degrees, which is compared to the human RSOs, who typically are looking at around 55 degrees off nadir angle. It allows you to fly higher, between 500 and 600 feet above ground level, at a higher oblique angle, and which allows you to see through the vegetation a bit more effectively. And show a few examples of the various setups that we can use for the oblique camera counts. This is an alternative setup using a strut-mounted camera, a system which we developed at TAWIRI and has been used in a few different places. This is much easier to configure because a lot of people can't actually afford to modify their aircraft. In the case of a lot of the institutional surveys that I do in Zambia and Tanzania and other places, you simply can't get the same aircraft every time you go and do a survey that's run by, for example, the Department of National Parks and Wildlife at TAWIRI. You're simply given an aircraft by the ministry, and even if you had one modified aircraft, your chance of getting it would be quite low. So we needed to have something which is much more flexible and to be able to use the same high-wing aircraft, which is so common. We calibrate the cameras in the same way that the human eye is calibrated for a ground distance for a 150 meter strip. In the case of the images you see here, we are trying to match the human field of view, the RSO's field of view, to do comparative studies. The cameras are triggered at 2-second intervals, giving us about 50% overlap at the speeds that we fly. This can be done either using a preset intervalometer, in the case of the external cameras, or in the case of an internal camera, Rich simply then press his button and get his intervalometer firing on board the aircraft. The systems have to have onboard power and they have to have enough resolution to be able to distinguish animals on the ground effectively in your target species. So for example, here gives an example of the field of view of both an RSO and the red lines and the camera set up for a parallel. This is doing a parallel camera count in the Kaza area last year. So you get exactly the same angle of view. In this case, though it looks like you're seeing a very different strip, when you are flying at 300 feet and you're looking at a 150 meter strip width, that 1 meter different offset between the two cameras is effectively meaningless. Between the human and the camera field of view is effectively meaningless. What we end up with is a series of overlapping trapezoids as you fly along the flight path. This gives a bit of a better picture of what is actually going on, because as the aircraft rolls, the trapezoid geometry can change. And I'm not going to go into too much detail on this, but Rich's paper about Savo really covers this very, very well, and some of his other articles about Uganda. But there are ways of actually ensuring that you're still getting a good area estimate as well as your wildlife estimates. That extreme roll shown by the trapezoid in the middle there, frame 144, is quite extreme. You rarely get that much roll. During image analysis, the RSO count, the OCC count, means that you often have overlapping imagery. So, for example, these two images show the area of overlap and the set of animals that you would see in one frame but not the other in the image 0780. And image analysis is done at the moment, is mostly done by manual interpretation, typically 250 images per day per counter, per person doing the image interpretation. So given that we take around 300,600 images per hour per aircraft, 1 hour flight time represents about 14 interpreter days of work at present. We know that we can analyze fractions of the imagery and get the same abundance estimates. So this implies that we're going to be able to optimize if we use plot-based counting instead of always using strips. And the Uganda and Savo data sets showed that there were no significant differences between odd and even frames. If you counted these two, one is the odd data set, one is the even data set. Looks like we really have no significant difference. But there is a trade-off when you're counting fewer images, in that there is a relatively poor distribution mapping from these reduced photo counts. Give an example of why one of the reasons why you can see animals that were all missed during the RSO count that were picked up by the camera count. During hotter times of the day, animals are already in shade, and even here this was well within our normal parameters for seeing wildlife from the RSO count, but they were already in hiding. I'm going to skip discussions of Savo 2017 is one of our better direct comparisons between humans and camera counts, and there's some rather interesting differences. What we're looking at here, what's interesting is looking at the paired transects in the green column on the right. If you look at the species, the first column in the green shows the RSO count, the human eye estimate, and the second OCC count is the camera estimate. And all species show some differences with weak or very, very strong significance. Elephants are the biggest interest. There's about 12% difference between higher count from the observer counts, from the oblique camera count, I'm sorry. Giraffe are almost double, zebra about 22% higher, and large antelopes almost double, double the number that was seen by the human eye. The exceptions are carcasses, where the initial camera count saw estimated fewer, but I'll come back to that in a moment because the post-hoc correction factors actually show that the OCC count performed equally well. Buffalo as well were estimated to be higher by the RSOs, but we were unable to get photographic corrections for all of those images, so it is uncertain how much of that represents a counting bias. The SAVO total count, previously to SAVO, there was a total count done, and we can see that some even larger differences for giraffe and elephant, and the numbers for buffalo counts are even more profound here. And you can see the total counts miss a huge number of many species, but even elephants, which are larger and more visible, there's approximately 22% difference between the camera count and the total count, but other species are far more dramatic. The automated counting and the annotation system, since that's been well covered. But one thing I want to mention is that one of the big advantages we expect to find with the improvements in technology is filtering. Though it's quite funny that the camera, and you can see why the computer might have thought there was a bird with wings flapping around there. While this is a bit funny, what's important about this is it said, hey, there's something here that's worth looking at. It didn't think that some of the other vegetation and the strongly contrasting shadows were anything at all. So filtering will hopefully will enable us to dramatically increase the amount of time that it takes to do the image annotation, between possibly even a 10 times increase in the amount of images we can cover per day, because only 1 to 2% of images typically have any positives, anything of interest in them. So moving forward, we do have some good examples and practical uses, and so we're pretty sure this is a good candidate for becoming a standard method in a lot of other places. We need to have an authority or an institution turn this into some kind of standard, make it a standard operating procedure. The Uganda Wildlife Authority has already adopted this as a standard, with 11 full protected area counts, OCC counts, have been conducted by Richard's team, and is now, I don't think we're even doing RSO counts anymore. Things that we need to think about, though, are what are we going to be doing with our longer term data sets? And this is one of probably the biggest concern. Do we need to have correction factors moving forward? If there are these differences, if there's this relative bias, how do we understand our long-term trends given these change methods? So it may be that we need to have correction factors for some species, in particular elephant. For other species or for other ecosystems, it may be that the variability has been seen to be so high that we simply need to have new baselines moving forward. We draw a line under the old counts and we move forward with the new baseline using these methods. There are a lot of potentials for alternative sampling strategies, potentially using plot-based or point-based sampling from these images. There is a lot of work that can be done by going back and reviewing images and looking at correcting for detection bias and things like the amount of ground cover, looking at the canopy, doing canopy estimation. Michael Griffiths pointed out to me that 350 feet above ground, 150-meter strip width was selected because of the limitations of the human eye, allowing us to scan a very, very easy area. And it might be that we can move away from some of these areas and strip widths that we think about now. So this has been a rapid overview, well beyond the amount of time I was given, and I would like to hear any questions.